We've spent a lot of time on this show talking about the potential mental health risks and benefits of experiences occasioned by psychedelic medicines, but how do scientists and clinicians know if and to what extent a psychedelic experience is actually helpful or harmful? Well, we measure it. In today's episode of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast, we discuss the various ways that scientists and clinicians measure the psychedelic experience and the mental health outcomes of such an experience. We review a few popular questionnaires, discuss brain imaging studies, explore the limitations of these measurement tools, and much more. For those of you who are new to the show, welcome. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus and is hosted by me, Dr. Steve Thayer, and my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison. Just a few announcements real quick before we get into the episode. If you are looking for professional training pursuant to becoming a psychedelic-assisted practitioner, please check out the courses we offer here at Numinus. You can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/training, where you can use the code PTF10 for 10% off selected trainings. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've likely heard Reid and I talk about the psychedelic clinical trial work that Numinus does. If you or someone you know is interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/research, where you can learn more about the trials we're currently running. If you'd like to support our show, you can do so by leaving us a rating or review in places like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, please like the video and maybe subscribe to the channel. And of course, you can share this episode with somebody you think might enjoy it. Without further delay, here is the relatively nerdy episode on measuring the psychedelic experience. So, Reid, we talk a lot about psychedelic research on the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast. And,
nerds.
Total nerds. So we wanted to do a super nerdy episode today and talk more specifically about the ways some of these researchers are measuring the psychedelic experience and things related to the psychedelic experience.
Some of them, like you sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah. And how maybe some of these measurement strategies for the purpose of research might actually translate to the actual practice of psychedelic therapy, because we use measurement scales in practice all the time, right? We were talking before we hit record. If any of you have ever been to your therapist, your psychiatrist, you've likely taken some measures of like your depression symptoms.
They sneak it in symptoms. The intake forms, the check-in forms, like the PHQ-9.
Right. And so what are these measurements trying to do? We're trying to quantify a little bit. Put into numbers so we can track changes and maybe get an idea of severity of what people are experiencing. And of course, there are limitations to that approach, and there's lots of different ways to do it.
You know, this is one of the reasons why I went into psychiatry. I was attracted to both the art and the science. And the science, especially when I went into it, and still was considered like both softer and more of an unexplored frontier, right? The human brain. It's a little bit difficult at times to understand our brains with our brains, right? But measurement-based care or rating scales, assessment, measurement tools, they're called a lot of things. But it is really what both helps us understand a field, and then when working in that profession helps make a more accurate diagnosis and helps, like you said, track progress, change over time, track symptom severity. And some of them are done for safety purposes too, like the PHQ-9 that we mentioned. The most commonly widely used depression rating scale, used in primary care as well, is a great validated, extremely validated, we could talk about what that means, instrument that is self-report. So the doctor doesn't have to ask you the questions. You fill it out on your own. And it is very sensitive at detecting things like suicidality when it shows up.
Right. Yeah, the idea of sensitivity, specificity, and whether or not a questionnaire is valid is interesting when we're talking about the mind, because you mentioned the brain, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not like we have direct access and we can measure through a brain scan or something the condition of your soul. Mental health is tough to measure because I use the term operationalization, meaning we're trying to distill what it means to be sad or to be depressed or to be happy down to something that's measurable. And usually, like you pointed out with the PHQ-9, it's how do I rate my level of happiness or my level of sadness in response to these questions. So we get a good picture, and validation involves statistical analysis and comparing responses to questionnaires to other ways of measuring what's going on. But it's not like you're doing a blood test for depression.
Or an EKG even. Like an EKG is a step removed from your heart, but it is measuring the real-time electrical activity, right? Or
an aspect of your heart's functioning directly.
Yeah, and sure, they're not that common in psychiatry. They're extremely rare, and 99.9% of psychiatrists would have never ordered one, but there are functional imaging tests.
Right.
They're used more in some of the neurological, neuropsychiatric conditions or dementia, if at all, in psychiatry itself. But we don't have ways of taking a pulse of the brain very well, right, as much, or we haven't embraced the ones that are available very much in this field, like has been done in other professions.
Yeah, I mean, maybe listeners have heard of a guy named Daniel Amen. That's his name, right?
Yeah.
Daniel Amen, who's famous for using these brain scans,
SPECT
scans, to measure the brain functioning and then correlating certain levels, like results on that
ADHD
scan to a diagnosis, ADHD, and then making prescriptions or recommendations based on that. Like, oh, I can tell because of this scan, the way it looks, that you definitely have this kind of ADHD and you need more freaking blueberries or fish oil or something like that.
And he's very controversial in the academic circles because he's an example of kind of a brave, forward-looking, outside-the-box thinking individual who is literally pushing the envelope. And by doing so, you're probably going to push into territories that aren't validated and that are more prone to critique if you are perhaps erring on the side of being too conclusive with things. Because you do, like, imaging data sets are a mess too. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not so simple as your heart rate that would be measured the same across individuals, no matter what your skill set. But you take a brain scan, and then you could have a room full of experts debate what some of these, these changes mean that are measured in very high-tech, obscure ways.
Yeah, I love the idea, though. Like, it's the vital signs of, like, mental health vital signs, right? And when I was in graduate school, some of my professors created something called the OQ, the Outcome Questionnaire, which is a fairly widely used questionnaire.
Very, very much so.
And they give you great feedback, great data that you can look at, calling it basically mental health vital signs, like how do I take the pulse, so to speak, on somebody's sense of well-being. So I love the idea of those kinds of measurements guiding diagnosis and treatment. But to your point about what you're saying about, like, even the brain scan, there's a lot of noise in the data. So you have to include that data with thorough interview, with being with the person, gathering more info.
Here's my, I just can't resist sharing my real opinion on the OQ, because I like the OQ a lot, but why I don't use it brings up, I think, a relevant point is because it's a commercialized instrument that you have to pay for.
Right.
And I agree. I love the idea. I've spent a lot of my academic time, whether, if not using rating scales, sometimes creating them, and have been involved in the validation of some. But I like rating scales that are free. I know the world needs, something has to drive its economic engine. But I just really believe in, like, the rating scales get better when they're widely accessible too, because we have more data, massive normative data sets. And the OQ, I like it because it includes a bunch of symptom domains. Like, you could, in theory, give someone one measure instead of the PHQ-9, the GAD-7, and
PCL.
And a handful of other things. So it's great. But that's, who is it? Gary Burlingame.
Yeah,
if you're listening, Gary, sorry, nice work, but make it free, please.
My dissertation chair.
For clinicians,
I ended up doing my dissertation on one of his other measures. It was a validation study of the group questionnaire, which was something similar to the OQ, but it was trying to measure these different factors of group therapy to guide.
Yeah, I love this stuff, and I know it's nerdy, but my first ayahuasca retreat where I, was beforehand I had experience it for the first time. This was several years ago, but I worked as medical support and a facilitator. But one of my roles was in designing the data collection, and I used the OQ as one of the measures, the OQ 45. And that's when I ran into some of the difficulties, because it's also a problem when you go to publish too, if something has all sorts of copyrights around it. But I'm also a fan of removing obstacles to sharing good science with each other in the world, right? Like open access publishing, but that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah. Excellent point. So, but if we want to focus our conversation around the measurement of the psychedelic experience, maybe we can talk about some of the different measurement tools that are being used, both just to study the phenomenon of the psychedelic experience, but also to inform psychedelic assisted therapy.
Yeah. Okay. So we're at a fork in the road of two parts of this next discussion. One would be the acute psychedelic experience. How do you measure what happens on dosing day? We call it dosing day in like the clinical trial field, or dosing sessions, whatever. But you could call it ceremony day.
Yeah. The medicine day. Yeah.
But what happens after you ingest the substance that day? And then there are the instruments that measure what happens next.
Right.
Like,
or before.
Yeah, totally. Like your experiential avoidance, right? How much are you prone to resist or shy away from new experiences? That's a useful thing to know. So I use as an example as one of the things before or after you see these studies that report on psychedelics increased nature connectedness. How do you measure nature connectedness? Do you see how often someone goes and hugs a tree? You could, but that's harder to gather than asking them the questionnaire. And these surveys need to be, like we mentioned, I'll just reiterate it here, have to be validated. They're only used in studies when they have been psychometrically validated as a general rule, unless you're validating as part of this study. But that's a more complicated example.
Right. Yeah. And how are they validated? So an example that we pulled was this Imperial College measure, the psychedelic predictor scale.
Yeah.
And it's a short scale that is designed to kind of predict how a person might respond to the psychedelic experience. And it was validated by comparing the data, correlating each item, the subscale that they think, that the dimension of preparedness that they think it's measuring, with existing measures that already do have some validity. So if we think, a person's, see if I can find one of these here, like a person's intention or their rapport, the degree to which they feel like they have a good rapport with the facilitators, for example, does the way they rate on that particular subscale, does it correlate with emotional breakthrough in the psychedelic experience, or some aspect of the mystical experience that could be measured by the mystical experience questionnaire? And that's one way to validate these measures. They call it convergent validity, of different kinds of validity that you could measure. So that's just a little nerdy peek at what we're talking about when we're talking about validating a particular scale.
And I won't get into this, but just to point it out for completion is that you can validate a scale when there isn't an existing one but it's a different process. But this one, when you sent me the link to this study, this just came out within the last month or so. I think it was late September, the publication date. I was excited because it's been an area that, we certainly have felt is needed, like an area that we need to assess better, and that we've had to wrestle with, like with your clinical intuition and like on the fly assessments. And we could talk about how we do that, but predicting the psychedelic experience is a lofty goal and could be really handy if you could predict someone's how likely it is to be a difficult experience, or how likely they are to be extremely sensitive to low doses versus, higher, for example, or a million other ways that you might, use some good solid data beforehand.
Well, and these are the questions our clients have when they come to us seeking psychedelic assisted therapy, or any of you who are thinking about having a psychedelic experience, you're going to have these questions like, how do I know if this is right for me? How do I know if I'm ready? How can I prepare? Like, what are the reasonable things to do that would be effective in preparation so that I can have a fruitful experience? And so a scale like this is an effort to both draw from clinical intuition, surveying other experts in the field, like based on some theories, but also, like I was saying before, other data from other questionnaires to inform a short scale to help people answer those questions. So it makes sense from a research perspective, but also makes sense from a clinical perspective.
We've talked about it a lot on here, the difficult psychedelic experiences and the fact that and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but we both disagree that there are no bad trips ever.
Right. Like, meaning, yes, you can have a bad trip.
There can be bad outcomes and things that, maybe should not have occurred.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's some potential safety and therapeutic implications of having a more systematic way of assessing one's readiness.
Right.
And that's what I think they're getting at. And this comes out of Imperial College, which happens to be one of the institutions that's contributed probably the most of any academic institution to rating scales in recent years. It's where Robin Garrett-Harris was. Now he's at UCSF. But there's such a strong group. And they had that psychedelic survey project. I think it was psychedelicsurvey.com or org or whatever it was. But they collected so much data from the real world of people seeking out psychedelic experiences. But they got it before and after, so it was not all a retrospective, biased entirely by hindsight, even though it wasn't in a clinical setting. It was as people were going out to ceremonies, retreats, etc.
Right. Yeah. So one of the things I think is impressive about this scale is they were able to make it really short. And you do that by having lots of different items, lots of different questions, and then you do some fancy stats to see which ones, are most impressive for measuring the factor that you're trying to get at. So I just wanted to read off a couple of these items. So this is the psychedelic predictor scale again.
It's a 9-item scale, right?
Yeah, only 9 items. So I feel ready to surrender to whatever will be. I feel open to the upcoming experience. I feel well prepared for the upcoming experience. I feel comfortable about it.
What kind of scale is this? So, and maybe for background first, I'll just say that in general, there are 3 types, like those with a visual analog scale where there's this, let's say, a line and you're paying, where is it 0 to 10? Or there are dichotomous yes, no questions. And then there are Likert. The most common one's probably a Likert scale where you might have like strongly agree, somewhat agree, neither agree nor disagree, and et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. Because I just copied and pasted the chart. I don't have the full article.
I have the paper here.
Yeah.
But anyway, sorry, I interrupted.
But it's a good point. And the way the items are written, it could be either sort of a yes, no, I feel ready, or Likert, where they're rating on like a scale of 1 to 5.
Yeah, I'm guessing it's a Likert scale. 9 items, 3 factors: set, rapport, and intention. And then they had domains of, I guess the set include preparedness and openness. Rapport included interpersonal trust, and intention was just what it sounds like, personal goals.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and if you've listened to our podcast for a while, or if you know a little bit about psychedelic assisted therapy, you can kind of get it. Like these items are what they call it face valid, meaning you can read the item and you can get a sense for what it's getting at, and that these things are the things we talk about that are really important to have in place when you're preparing for a psychedelic experience, so that you can increase the likelihood it's going to be a therapeutic experience.
Yeah. So, might be useful to share. And I'm curious how you do it as well, Steve, is like, how do you assess this on the fly? What questions do you want to know from someone before having an instrument like this to assess their readiness? Because we get this question a lot.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I want to get a sense for why they're seeking the psychedelic experience. And that can give you clues about expectations, about potential intentions. If the expectations are just, maybe a little extreme,
They want to win the lottery, perhaps.
I want to talk to the oracle and again, get the lottery numbers. Or, something more reasonable but still potentially not helpful is I just want all my pain to go away. I don't want to feel bad ever. I want this to cure me of my depression.
And so you want to know that
beforehand.
Why?
Yeah, because it gives me a sense of, again, if their expectations might be a little bit impossible, then that could lead to disappointment. It could lead to disorientation in the medicine experiences.
Yeah.
This it's also fairly rigid, and we talk a lot about needing to be open to whatever might show up, to go in and through. One of the items here is I feel ready to surrender to whatever will be.
What is the item or two around intention, by the way? If you have it handy.
Yeah, I have clear intentions for the upcoming experience.
So this 9-question scale, for example, may get some of what you want to know, not all. And I think that's an important point, that rating scales are never, I can't ever say never, but are not a standalone diagnostic complete picture.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Like
I would never give this scale and look at the score and say, you're ready.
Without having your own interaction with the human.
Right. Yeah. It's a conversation starter.
Yeah. It's not a substitution for your clinical judgment, discretion, intuition, insight, and all that, but it's an awesome supplement, an important one that I think, in general, this topic about measuring the psychedelic experience is one of the things that will help the field of psychedelics mature to more widespread acceptance and avoid some of this drama that we've talked about so much on here, like the attempt at MDMA approval, etc.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if they took this scale and they rated that first item, I feel ready to surrender to whatever will be as a 0.
Yeah.
Then that's a good guide. It's a tool that informs, like you said, my clinical decision making and intuition to let's investigate that.
And I'm maybe extra tangential today, but bringing us right back. What else do you want to know from someone without a scale, like personally?
Yeah, I want to get a sense for what their if they have any existing skills for emotion management, grounding, how in touch or out of touch are they with their body? Because I want to make sure that they're well resourced going into what could potentially be a challenging psychedelic experience.
Yeah, I like that one a lot. Like what's their experience or relationship with their own emotions? And, it depends on, like if you're working with 50 people in a giant retreat or ceremony setting, you may have less time to dive into the childhood experience of each individual with emotions and how are they, how are they modeled and displayed and accepted or not in their home or whatever. But what else helps you predict someone's readiness or assess readiness?
Yeah, I mean, similar to something we were talking about before, but like a willingness to sit with what could be difficult emotions or experiences, a willingness to sit with, in particular, like uncertainty. And that's based on some theories we have about what is helpful for navigating a psychedelic experience, not only to just get through it, but also if you can surrender, if you can stay open and go in and through, then you might be able to mine the experience for something that you didn't expect that could be really, really useful. Yeah.
And to give an example of rating scales in action contributing to useful insight would be, there have been a number of different studies now that have looked at the psychedelic experience and things like the Emotional Breakthrough Inventory, the EBI, that I think you briefly mentioned, and the Mystical Experience Questionnaire that many people have heard of, but it's probably one of the most commonly used measures of the actual experience on the medicine. So those studies looked at the scores of individuals in both of those things, and then what happened next. Did their depression improve, stay the same, get worse? And then one of the insights that I've pulled from that body of research is that if someone has a strong mystical experience, like a high score on the MEQ, and they have an emotional breakthrough, a high EBI score, meaning they faced something difficult and survived it, got to the other side, flexed some kind of emotional muscle, and made it to the other side, then they're more likely to have positive, lasting transformation. As a oversimplified summary, but you can see how that kind of insight can be useful.
Yeah. It points to the variables that are changing that allow a person to feel less depressed or have some kind of transformation. There's also some interesting research that suggests there are some mediating variables between mystical experience and positive outcome. One of which is you mentioned emotional breakthrough, but is psychological flexibility. So, in as much as the mystical experience led to psychological flexibility, it is then more likely to lead to positive outcomes. And then another one is the rapport, which this IPPS scale sort of tries to measure at the outset.
IPPS.
Yes, the Imperial Psychedelic Predictor Scale. But do you have a good therapeutic working relationship with your facilitators or with your therapists?
Yeah, that's a good one, an interesting one, because we've talked about how many times when you fly off to some place in Costa Rica for a fancy experience with a serious plant medicine, you may not have any rapport yet.
Right.
And so it's something that understandably people they're wary of for a reason. And it's just a reminder to that can be established, sure, when you get somewhere. But it's important.
Right. Yeah. Another questionnaire that they used to validate this one against was the Communitas scale, which also speaks to relationship and is especially relevant for those group type experiences, like an ayahuasca ceremony.
Yeah,
Do you feel a sense of togetherness?
Yeah, it's a cool name.
Communitas.
Communitas. Yeah. Published in 2021. I have a little summary here. Assesses moments of being in harmony with the group and feeling a sense of belonging and connection to the group. It's pretty cool, huh?
Yeah, which
8 items.
Can be in and of itself really, really healing for people who feel especially isolated and alone.
Yeah. And you mentioned the number of items kind of as being important. And just to point out a little more on why is when we do these studies or see people clinically, I think as clinicians, we think about the burden on the client a lot. Like when I'm sending a questionnaire, if it's an 87 item one and I want to send 5 more, how much time am I really asking of someone?
Right.
And so that's why some of these do get validated and as new measures where there was an existing one that was just extremely burdensome, for example.
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned the OQ45. They distilled that down to 30 items, the OQ30. And so, we're talking about preparation and its measurement. There's another scale, the Psychedelic Preparedness Scale that I found. I don't have a reference for who came up with that one. I don't know if you have that one too, but just an effort to quantify readiness for the psychedelic experience again. And they noticed that higher preparedness scores correlated with more positive outcomes.
Yeah,
notable
makes sense.
Improvements, yeah. And they broke it down a bit differently than the other scale, but it was still around expectations and knowledge of what they're getting themselves into, intention and preparation. There was one subdomain, psychophysical readiness, addresses the individual's readiness to confront and accept challenging emotions and experiences and a recognition of physical sensations that might accompany the psychedelic state.
Yeah, because I agree with one of the points you said about your kind of clinical assessment. I think is important. Does the individual have relevant skills to navigate and have some kind of ground control during the experience from that medicine or any other medicine with a state change or altered state of consciousness,
right.
Or even non-ordinary states, not from non-medicine. But I'm thinking of time and time again, I've seen people from different backgrounds, like Zen meditators, seem to have this ability to sit in lotus, like you're talking about like a 20, 30 year long-term, deeply experienced meditator, the ability to sit through a tsunami of a psychedelic experience and stay in that sitting position, that doesn't mean they don't have a wild trip or don't have things shaken up like a snow globe inside. But we all navigate everything in life differently, including and especially the psychedelic experience. And it's kind of it comes from nature and nurture and everything that's happened with you and everything you've practiced and to that point. But I had a client the other day in clinic who on their questionnaire, they told me about 2 past mushroom experiences and that were heroic, I think they mentioned something, they were
high dose
and the maybe positive effects, hard to tell or whatever. But if I had just taken it at that, that's all I would have gotten. But when I was sitting with the individual and asked about them, they told me that, there was like a heroic dose where I felt almost nothing. And that's another thing that's fun to dive into more, because you can peel away layers and get some good information there. But then they had like a double or triple heroic dose and also didn't have much of an experience. So that's like a different kind of category of preparedness to assess. Like maybe someone has some big levels of resistance, or maybe they have the physiologic anomaly, whether it's from medical conditions, medications they're on, or something in their genetic makeup that makes them respond a bit differently.
Just like if we go back in time, it would be interesting to have given this person the predictor scale, like the psychedelic predictor scale, and see how they answered that I feel ready to surrender to whatever shows up item, right?
I'm just chuckling because I'm thinking back to when I went out to the jungle with rating scales in hand, like literally printed many folders. And we did get the MEQ the morning after each ayahuasca ceremony. We had people not even talk until after breakfast. It was eating in silence, but they would fill these out before they've even talked to a human about it. And they were so fun to look at the scores, and to think about, this person who was yelling or whatever, what was their MEQ score? And also these, if you dig into the measures, you could see that what are the cutoffs, if there are any, like 60%, for example, on each of the domains of the MEQ is considered a complete mystical experience. So you could kind of, whether you're looking at subdomains or total score, get a quick idea of, they had a complete mystical experience, or this person only had, these parts super high, but didn't have any ego dissolution or whatever.
Yeah. So the phrase complete mystical experience made me have another nerdy thought about questionnaires is, we started the conversation talking about how these questionnaires, we're trying to operationalize something, trying to measure it, trying to get a peek at what it is. We also want to be careful not to reify questionnaire scores or results, meaning, if somebody doesn't have a so-called complete mystical experience measured by the mystical experience questionnaire, should they feel, bad about that? Should they feel like that they missed out on something?
I want my money back.
Right. So, these aren't perfect x-rays of your soul necessarily. No. Like we've been talking about, they give us some clues.
X-ray of the soul is a cool term, though.
I know. I should start a band called X-ray.
X-ray of the
do
soul. It.
Can I get my point though? Like,
these are trying to be more objective, but prone to all sorts of subjectivity of the human experience and the limitations of language. Like we're asking people about the ineffable in a questionnaire of words, and you can see how there's some inherent challenges.
I see that with personality tests, right? People are like, I'm a 2 on the Enneagram. That means I am this person, and it is my destiny, and this perfectly describes me. Or I'm on the MBTI, I'm a INFJ or something like that, or I'm a freaking Hufflepuff on the Facebook.
They're data points, right? And some are valid. It's important to know how valid. And something could be a validated instrument, but it could be brand new with bare bones compared to something that's been, like, I also like take the newer scales with the grain of salt because they are newer and try them on. But I think your point is a very good one of these are data points that go into the big picture.
Right.
Yeah.
So any other scales?
Yeah. So
let's fun to talk about.
Let's see. I mentioned nature relatedness. Some other ones that are used to measure what happens after, social connectedness scale. I mentioned experiential avoidance, but there's like a flourishing scale, perceived success and confidence in areas across like relationships, self-esteem. We've used in a lot of different studies the Spielberger state anxiety or state trait anxiety inventory, where I find that one really interesting because there's anxiety as a trait, like your baseline, how anxious are you in general in the world, and then there's your state in the moment. And I think if you're talking about anxiety, it's extremely helpful to zero in on what you're talking about and look at those categories. And then there are a lot of measures of kind of mindfulness along those same lines. If you think about anything that's been concluded out of studies of like nature relatedness as an example, they had to get that through some kind of validated measure. So if you want to do a study or check yourself pre and post ceremony, or check people in a retreat you're participating in or facilitating, then you go pull that paper, find that measure, and use it.
Right. Yeah. That makes me curious, and maybe research has been done on this, but people who are high in trait anxiety or high in neuroticism on a test like the Big Five, are they more likely to have a challenging psychedelic experience as measured by something like the challenging experience questionnaire?
Yeah. So this is an example of, I love these questions because that is like research waiting to happen, or like a hypothesis ready to be birthed and tested. And so using that as an example, you could design a prospective study and bring people in, give them the med or a placebo and a bunch of questionnaires before, during, after. Or if you happen to have a data set, what a lot of researchers will do is start with a retrospective look at data. If you have another study you did where you happen to collect that, you could then go and
look at those
and
variables,
analyze the data. And that's often an important starting place for how kind of research results begin to take shape and grow, and justify the funding and the energy going into prospective studies that really get to a more confident answer.
Right. Yeah. Another scale that stood out to me that just sounds fun is the Phenomenology of Consciousness Inventory, the PCI.
I want to try that one immediately.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of the sub-scales here, like excitement, love, sexual arousal, altered experience, altered body image, altered sense, altered perception.
Yeah, intriguing.
Absorption, self-awareness, internal dialogue, volitional control. Yeah, a lot of really interesting aspects to this one. Yeah. It's an older one, back in the 90s, but
it reminds me of a scale that I really like using that comes from the eating disorder world, but I've used it outside of there, even in like some psychedelic or general mental health studies, or even in a group where I wanted to assess people's level of embodiment. It's the Experience of Embodiment scale by Neva Piran. She's a researcher in the eating disorder community out of Canada, who I heard her speak on it at a conference, and kind of have collaborated with her a bit since, got her textbook on it. But the experience of embodiment, what does that mean? Like when you get into the scale, the domains, there's physical, mental, and social. You might not think of embodiment this way, but another thing I love about rating scales is what they teach me about a condition or an experience. Like they help me look at things from different angles that I wouldn't, including in myself. And doing research has made me, in my biased opinion, a much better clinician than I would be otherwise because of how it's taught me to think about things. But physical would be like safety, respectful ownership of your body, joyful, attuned activity, self-care, desires, validation of desires. The mental would be like appearance and comportment related, traditional expectations, punitive labels. A lot of this you can see how it comes from is relevant, especially to the eating disorder world and the cultural beauty ideals that are unattainable and body image distress. Then the last one would be social, like how much can you and your body counteract prejudice, or how much do you feel empowered in your relationships? Because we forget about the body is empowerment manifested. Anyway, I bring it up as an example of how rating scales can really be perspective enhancing too.
Yeah. So it helps you see the dimensions of what embodiment might mean. That maybe you hadn't considered before.
In yourself, in individuals, in groups, in studies, and in a concept. So the other kind of related thing is, that Stan Grof quote of psychedelics will be to the mind like the telescope was to astronomy.
Or the microscope.
I'm paraphrasing, but I think what that means, or when I read that, it's often quoted, and a quote I quite like. But what struck me when I read that is, as a clinical researcher who was doing studies before, psychedelic studies, where we would give take-home pills and measure someone's depression 6 weeks later. I mean, we'd measure it every week, but an SSRI study, for example, it takes some time to kick in, and of course the response isn't as good as we'd want it to be in some people. But just that time component introduces a world of bias, because people go home. Like when you're in a psychedelic experience, there is some real time stuff happening and real time transformation, and I do think that Stan Grof was right. Is that psychedelics, besides being a tool for spirituality, for mental health conditions like we talk about on here, are also already a very powerful tool in helping us understand our minds.
Yeah, that makes me think of our sort of earlier points around neurophysiology too, when we were talking about Daniel Amen. Another way to measure the psychedelic experience is the way people like Card Harris that you mentioned, or Gould Dolan, are measuring it, and that's by actually looking at the brain, like what happens in the brain. Because this, like your comparison to an SSRI, when you give somebody a significant dose of psilocybin, their brain starts to function very differently, fairly immediately, right? As soon as that hits the brain. And you'll hear what have now become pretty trendy phrases like the default mode network and how it changes, or these, referencing Gould Dolan's research, these critical windows of social learning that open and close.
It makes me think of Brian Johnson, who's in the news a lot right now, right? The millionaire who is fighting aging.
Right.
And
millionaire Dracula.
Fascinating to see his path and the protocols that come of it and everything. But before he was doing this, he was CEO and founder of a company called Kernel that developed this new technology. This is after he stole his startup. Was it PayPal?
You said sold or stole?
Sold. Sorry, I'm mumbling today. But was it PayPal or something like that? Where he made his money, but then he started this company called Kernel that made a way of, it was essentially like something in between EEG and MRI in a helmet. And I've put this on and had it done and got the report because we talked about collaborating. It was really fascinating because he went himself and got ketamine treatments, put the helmet on, and the results were shared, published at least as a poster, where their device was able to measure at least some kind of proxy for neuroplasticity from the device and see the window of neuroplasticity, where Gould-Dolan studies come from rodents or other animals mostly. And yeah, so it's a fascinating world, interesting time. I think we're just at the beginning, the birth of a real renaissance in understanding this mysterious mind.
Well, and then combining the two approaches of questionnaires and then neuroimaging is
And
really
gene expression, why not?
Yeah, there you go. Metabolites in the blood, all this stuff, because then you can start to make some guesses and some correlations between, when the default mode network is downregulated, or when there's less activity in the prefrontal cortex and more crosstalk between brain regions that don't normally communicate, it seems to correlate with people who report X type of experience.
Yeah. And it's this concept of, some would call it in the academic circles, and I'm worried we're probably being extra nerdy in this episode, so apologies.
It'll appeal to some and not to others.
But the idea of intermediate phenotype, like a phenotype is an expression of like your DNA and all the other stuff inside in the world, and it
What's
could be
observable.
it could be a temperament trait, it could be your head size, circumference, or whatever. But intermediate phenotypes in psychiatry would be anything like a step more specific than the diagnosis itself. Like in ADHD, as an example, that's a diagnosis, but there are a lot of different circuits and domains involved, like executive function, attention, distractibility, movement, fidgetiness, etc. And
irritability.
So when we do research on a condition, the more we can drill in on the closer to biology we can get, the more likely we are to be able to get a real accurate look at what's going on or find out something. And I think what you're speaking to is an important part of the path forward. I think that's already happening in psychiatry. It's just going to be a slow, maybe forever crusade.
Well, yeah, because the human mind and certainly the brain are infinitely complex. I mean, we're dealing with an organ that is more complex than the freaking universe.
There's a mystery there, and it's
pretty
fun.
mysterious.
Yeah.
And I think Card Harris even said this, even saying like, psychedelics, what they do is they downregulate the default mode. He says is an oversimplification. It's an interesting way to sort of think about it and maybe summarize what might be going on.
He might say they disrupt brain network dynamics.
We should have him on and ask him what he would say.
Okay, Robin.
Thinking about psychedelic questionnaires at other sort of phases of the psychedelic journey. There's one that UC Berkeley Center for Science of Psychedelics came out with, 2 scales, integration engagement scale and the experienced integration scale. So their experience of integration, but also how they're engaging with integration. Integration being, the period after a medicine session where you're trying to make sense of what happened and leverage what happened for personal growth and development and healing. And so I just thought some of the items on that scale were pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So the engagement scale being, how am I reflecting on it? Have I given myself enough mental space to reconnect to the experience? I've read, viewed, or listened to informative content relative to my experience, gained insights about my experience. And then there's an application subdomain. So reflection subdomain and an application subdomain on the engagement scale.
So every time we do a psychedelic dosing session in our studies, we do a lot of questionnaires that are clinician administered. Some we ask the questions, and some that they do on paper or tablet themselves. And pretty much after every dosing session, we'll give people the post-dosing session questionnaires, or maybe they do it that night or the next morning. But I lost my train of thought already, and I had a clear-cut one.
Well, let your brain rest for a second, and I'll just talk about the experienced psychedelic integration scale. So that was the other one. And so this is subdomains being settled subdomain, harmonized, and improved subdomain, where they're talking about whether or not they feel at peace, whether they feel balanced, whether they're embracing the experience, if they are experience of self and experience of the world. Anyway, just interesting subdomains that you can imagine using scales like this to really help drill down into what's going on for a person during integration relative to their psychedelic experience. But go. It sounds
Is there
like
a scale that measures your how prone you are to losing your train of thought? Because it only happens on the podcast, but that's happened multiple times. No, but I did remember
the scale
where the train was going.
Your chronological age. How about that?
Okay. So yeah, another thing I was going to say is when we give those questionnaires to people after a dosing session, I think they're extremely helpful for the individual as well, even though we're doing this because the research study needs it for understanding. But what it does to an individual to sit with these questions, like the ones that you were just reading off as an example, is good integration. I think within reason. We don't want to burden someone with 1,000 questions that increases their state anxiety tremendously. But like it's a way of looking inward and with prompts and questions and from angles that we may not have otherwise.
Yeah. I found it to be really helpful for people. There is a certain phenotype where people tend to be for whom filling out questionnaires like this is torture. It's people who tend to overthink a bit. They want to make sure they're responding to these questions precisely. They'll often get, sort of argue or protest with the way the question is worded. I don't know that I can, especially if it's a yes or no question, like, well, this is a maybe. And that's where there's noise in the data. Like it's not perfectly representing how people really feel. But I've noticed when using questionnaires for people in hopes, like you said, that it will be helpful for some of them, that experience in and of itself is a little distressing, but it can lead to interesting conversations about that particular preoccupation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. As an example, there's one that's widely used in mental health and primary care called the ACE questionnaire, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And that's another mega validated measure. It's a one-time thing because it's asking you about your childhood and the kind of traumatic experiences that may have been present for you. And so when people fill that out, they are looking back at difficult things. So there is, you need to be sensitive to someone's readiness to dive in deep on any front, including past trauma. So I think that's just a disclaimer.
Yeah. It's an excellent point. Well, we're running a little low on time. We have a hard out today. Okay. Anything else on your mind about measuring the psychedelic experience?
We could geek out forever on these, but I think that's probably a good enough dose for today.
Yeah, hopefully it was a good taste for those of you who are interested in the nerdy stuff and also the applicable stuff. So thanks for listening. Until next time. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinus at numinus.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinus YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.